In this module here, we're going to go ahead and talk about deploying and implementing data solutions. We're going to cover several of these just to give you an idea of what to look for, what to study, and how to prepare for this exam. When it comes to deploying and implementing data solutions, you certainly want to remember that each of these solutions, of course, have a specific use case, but also there's limitations and uh, other facets like costing to be aware of. So we'll touch on the areas that I think are most important around this section for the exam. Let's go ahead and talk about BigQuery first. Now, BigQuery is a data warehouse. You can query against it with SQL, and you have the ability to upload a data set and query against it. Very powerful tool. One of the confusing parts on the exam was they really wanted you to know how storage costs were incurred, but also how you basically subscribe to the service, on demand or flat rate. And in the cost calculator demo, I went through what to look for, but I want to highlight this again. I recommend you take 5 minutes and look at this page for BigQuery pricing. And the reason is because on the exam, they definitely went out of their way to test your knowledge on BigQuery pricing. So no on-demand versus like a flat rate. That's how the service you would subscribe to it basically. You don't need to know like the details per se, but do realize that storage is an additional cost to running the queries. So just be aware of that. All right, let's go over to the console. And when we go over here, we want to scroll down to the big data services. So we have BigQuery, PubSub, DataProc, DataFlow, and then machine learning and IoT and all these other services that you don't really need to worry about for this exam. I did want to cover BigQuery, PubSub, and DataFlow, and I'll touch on DataProc. I did see questions on BigQuery, PubSub, and DataFlow on this exam, so that's where I want to focus. So if we go over to BigQuery, we just simply select that. Brings us over to BigQuery. Now you can see that there was some queries that were being ran. Some of these are incorrect. I did this just to show you, like basically you want to use standard SQL. So you use a select statement, select from, and order by. That's assuming you're actually querying the right data set. Now you can go over here to, I think it's, what was it, this page? I just lost my place. Here it is. Actually right there. I thought I had it up, but I guess I didn't. So there's some, one of the things I recommend is you're going to need a good couple hours to play around with BigQuery to see how it works. And if you don't know SQL, there's going to be a good learning curve with this. You don't need to know really any of this for the exam. They seem to just want to make sure you know about data sets and also how to import data, for example. But there are public data sets that you could go ahead and use against it. So you go ahead and import these. And if you look, you could see that the data sets are available on the BigQuery Reddit site. And if you scroll down, just read, you'll find different data sets that are available. And if we go back, there's a few public data sets that are loaded here, like New York City, yellow cab drivers or whatever. Trust books, so on and so on. So there's ones that you could play around with. Then, for example, if you want to query against something, you just go select the table here, and it'll put it in there. So you go ahead and select several of these data sets. Basically, these are the data sets here, and then you have tables, and then you've got the rows and columns that you can go ahead and take a look at. Now, again, just take your time looking at this. For the exam, there isn't too much you need to know on this, except for I do want to point out one more thing. And if I go back here to right here, compose query. So the compose query, again, you cut and paste your query here, or that's the query editor, or you go over to the UDF editor as well. So you have a couple options there, and then you could save it and show and do all this really cool stuff. And you could also go, if you go to this little icon here, create a new data set. Could also change encryption. So if you want to do uploads from your own data services to BigQuery, you could do that as well. Change encryption. You could also change the projects that you're looking at as well. And again, a lot of capabilities. So if you go to create new data set, go over here, put in an ID. The location, you can go ahead and put in the location of the data set. If it expires, whatever you want to call it, and create it at that approach. Now, if we go over here, you want to use, first of all, before you do anything, look at the Quick Start Guide. And then also to look at cost control options. Like I said, the pricing will be something that confuses people. And this is a good way to run up your cloud bill if you're not careful. So take some time to look at this as well if you're going to use the service. Not so much for the exam, but just be aware that this is something you want to pay attention to. Now, also too, service accounts, you want to, of course, give permissions to the right service account. Remember what a service account is. We had discussed that. And again, you could set up authentication with the right APIs to your cloud services if that's what you'd like to do. Now let's go over here to home again. And if I go over to PubSub now PubSub is really focused on basically allowing you to process asynchronous data. And basically the goal of this is to help notify you or help, respond to a trigger in a lot of cases. So what you want to do is create a topic. And you can see that there's one topic here. You can create another topic. And again, you create a subscription to that topic as well. And over here is the subscriptions. Now, if you go back to Cloud PubSub, you want to just pay attention to as well when you create a topic. Just be aware that you could make this as simple or as complex as possible. So look at the naming. You have up to 255 characters to work with. And then if we go back here to data services, let's just talk about data proc briefly. Now, with data proc, this is going to be for your Apache services. This is for Hadoop, essentially. And basically, you could run a managed, Hadoop cluster, basically. And this is a great service for the right situation. So you have to enable the API first. And of course, to enable an API, you have to do this where? Pretty much in IAM, right? But it'll let you get that started here. And then once you're done with enabling the API, you create a cluster. And when you create a cluster, you want to really pay attention to what you're doing here. There's different regions you could select. Now, global is exactly what it sounds like. And again, if you go to the question mark, basically this is a regional service. And basically, again, it helps you determine what zones and resources that are available. So in this case here, if I select global, again, you could access this globally. You want to, of course, make sure you pay attention to the zone. Or you could, select, for example, what was it, Europe West 4, right? And then select a zone off of that region. Now, this allows you to relegate the traffic and how the service costs your organization as well. So pay attention to a couple things. Now, there's different cluster modes in Dataproc. Just be aware that you need a minimum of 3 masters and a number of workers, essentially, for high availability. And then when we go down to machine type, the worker nodes, you can basically configure the master nodes how you want and the machine nodes. And again, pay attention to when you're configuring this, because there's a lot of costs that can really rack up really quickly. You create a staging bucket with cloud storage as well, and also select specific images to use as well for Apache as well. And that's clusters. And then if there's jobs going on, you could go ahead and create a job once you have the cluster up. Again, there's no jobs running. You could submit a job, and a job is what? That's going to allow you to basically process data. And again, this is really a couple things to pay attention to. So that's Dataproc. The main thing to know about Dataproc is that this is used for Apache services. And then data flow. Now, data flow basically is used for pipelines. So basically, again, to use data flow, you have to have the API enabled. And you can go over here and follow the tutorial if you want. I'm going to cancel that. And again, you could go over here to just define the SDK for Java Flow, for data flow for Java. And again, take a look at that as well. We'll go back here. You could also create a job from a template. Now, a template, again, you want to identify where it's located and whatever template you're using. For example, these templates are meant to help you get started with data flow. So for example, if you want to use a popular one would be, for example, going over to where is it? Text to data store. So like GCS cloud storage to data store. And again, you can see there's a lot to configure with these different services. So data flow, again, you're going to really use this for a pipeline. And if we go back one more, we want to just go take a quick look at storage. And with storage, a couple things to point out. First of all, just be aware that there's different types of data storage. When it comes to managing storage, you want to really pay attention to, for this exam, cloud storage. Now, when it comes to creating a bucket, they do expect you to know how to create a bucket. And they want you to be aware of the storage classes, like why would I want to use regional versus cold line? And again, if you're going to store data for more than 30 days, then you should look at using nearline. On the other hand, if you're going to store data for a year or more, you may want to look at cold line. So understand the right classes. And if you go to compare classes, it sort of tells you, and this is a nice feature that they put in there finally, and it really tells you, why would you want to use each, and here's the costs and availability. And for the exam, you'll definitely want to know the different storage classes. So again, you'll get a question or two. I got a couple asking about, should I use regional or should I use nearline or cold line? And again, you want to use cold line if you're pretty sure you're not going to access it, more than once a year. So look at that as a possibility. Now, when it comes to nearline, this is, basically less than 30 days, keep it on regional, but more than 30 days, keep it on nearline as a good option for mitigating costs. And the goal of these storage classes is to help you as a customer mitigate costs and performance. In other words, if you don't need to keep it on higher performing classes, then don't. This is really a form of tiering is really what it is. Now there's advanced settings like encryption. You could use your own key or the Google supplied key. And again, just creating a bucket is fairly straightforward. When it comes to transfer, another area that they really like to talk about was transfers. When you create a transfer, you have 3 different options. You could go ahead and transfer data from a cloud storage bucket. So let's say I want to transfer data from this, from this folder, and if there is something in there, right, I can go ahead and select that one. And again, I select, let's see, for AWS Guru, so I select that one. And then what I need to do is go over here, is specify filters. Like I could specify whatever, types of files or names. I could go ahead and use tags, whatever I want to do. If the file's older than so many days, migrate it. If not, just leave it. Then I just go continue. Now I have another, this is the source that we just looked at. Now we want to select the destination. And again, I could go over here and just double check, see one file in there. So I go to test bucket 012, and I go ahead and migrate it from one bucket to another. And I go ahead and overwrite or delete whatever I want to do. So I go ahead and overwrite the destination files, but then delete the objects on the source. And if I go continue, I go ahead and run it now. And that transfer job will work. So remember for the exam that there is a storage migration service that you could use to migrate buckets. You can migrate from Google Cloud buckets, like from one region to another, or you could use it for AWS, or you go to another site as well. So a couple different options. Now this will take a few minutes and we'll come back to it. And now we can see that the transfer has completed. And if we go over here, it tells us that there was a 430 meg. That was transferred a good amount of storage, essentially. And you could see that there is 1,800 files that were transferred. And if we go back here to transfer appliance, this is a solution that you could use if you have a good amount of storage to transfer. In this case here, they recommend about 20 terabytes or more. And you could order the appliance and it will be sent to you based on the requirements in your account with Google. Over here, you could go to also look at project access. Now, by default, you can see that these are the IDs that are assigned. There's also the ability for you to go in and look at IDs and understand different facets of IDs. Now, one of the things that was on the exam was about access to objects. With this area here, there is some things that I want to point out. Access control list. Basically, an ACL is going to apply to an object. So when you create that object, it's either specified explicitly or applied by default. In other words, the ACL will grant access to that. So again, what is the difference, right? Explicitly is just saying, hey, this is how it needs to be configured. And then applied by default is going to take what? The default permissions. So again, just look at, if you change the default object ACL for a bucket, it does take time to propagate as well. Now, read the best practices. You don't want to provide permission or owner permission to people you don't know, of course. You may want to delegate control of your buckets. Be aware of certain behaviors. Once again, a lot to cover here. Let's go back to the browser. Now, you could see a couple things to point out. Is on the exam too, there was a couple questions on life cycles. Now you go over here and select the lifecycle. So you have the ability to add a lifecycle. In other words, a lifecycle says, I want this bucket to do this, and I want these objects in that bucket essentially to do this. Basically, when the age of that object gets over a specific number of days, in this case, do this. Go ahead and move it to nearline or move it to cold line. And again, this is how you just create a lifecycle. Very simple. Now, one of the areas as well to pay attention to was Requestor Pay. So interestingly enough, you could make the person who's accessing the bucket pay for that service. If you need to turn it on, you have to realize that the data charges will be billed to the requester, and you won't be billed for that. And if you enable that, you'll see that it's on. Now, again, this is really useful, especially if you're going to do this with some kind of chargeback involved. You're not going to want to set this probably for publicly available objects, just because there's no way to, unless if you set up some kind of interface to charge for it, there really isn't a good way to do this. Google on the back end, though, again, if you've got this set up for your projects or in your organization, great, you can use this pretty effectively. That's how it will be set up. Now, you could edit labels and bucket permissions as well. Over here, you could change, again, the members. Over here, you can see how many members are listed, and so on and so on. So there's a lot to know in storage. And if we just go back actually to here, we go to Cloud SQL, for example, and I go to browser. And looks like we have some latency going on here. Okay, so now I'm over here at Cloud SQL. And you can see that there's one instance running. You could see that the storage used is 1 gig out of 10. High availability is not set. I could add it if I want. There's a public IP, and I'm using MySQL 2nd generation. If I go over here, you could see that the number of bytes has steadily gone up over a couple minutes anyways. I could connect to the instance. So if I copy this IP, I can go ahead and connect to that instance. And the instance name is right here as well. Now, if I go over here, I got a few options. I go to edit, could edit that. Now, remember, when you configure an instance, the region you can't change. Once you deploy Cloud SQL, it's deployed in that region, so just be aware of that. You can change the zone, though, so be aware of that. One of the things, too, is, and this is a good, for better performance, keep it close to the services that you need. So again, try to understand your service structure to make this as efficient as possible. My whole thought on Cloud SQL for this exam is there's really a few things that you should know. And again, it's really hard to go through all kinds of information, like for a 5-day class or a 3-day class in about 8 hours. But what I'd recommend is that if you're not familiar with SQL, you definitely want to know at least 2 things for this exam. The first is appreciate that Cloud SQL is regional. And the second thing to pay attention to is IAM. So let's go over to authorization. Now, you can authorize other applications to access Cloud SQL, but you need to authorize this. So what you have to do is you have to add a network. And again, you need to, let's say you want to access this via your corporate network. You can do that. You just have to enter the proper information and set up your security to attend to that. You could also authorize App Engine as well, and you could also authorize other services. Now, with IAM in pretty much any Google service, you have to go over to the IAM page, right over to IAM admin. But let's talk about service accounts. Now, Cloud SQL does have requirements for a service account if you're going to have, like, for example, a Hadoop instance or compute engine or any other service access Cloud SQL. That's, a non-user account. So you go ahead and you select the project, and then you select the service accounts that you'd like to connect, and you add them as a member. Remember that, again, if you want the project to access, you have to add it as a member. And so you select the role, and you can see that the roles are different. I could change that to owner, and I go new member, and again, I have to, create a new member. And you can see that it's telling you need to add in the right information. Now, in this case here, look at what you can add. You can add a G Suite domain, an email, a service account, or a G Suite domain. Actually, I just read that over. So again, that's what you can add. So just instead of adding my email, I will just leave it the way it is. And you can see that you just go ahead and add that. Once again, on the exam, they're going to expect you to know how to add a service account and where do you add a service account for Cloud SQL. The answer to that is where? IAM admin, service accounts, select the project, and then add the member appropriately. Now, let's go ahead and discard the changes. Now, one of the things too with scalability of Cloud SQL, this is more of a vertical scaling. It does scale for reads slightly, but if you need to scale horizontally, you have to use Cloud Spanner. So let's go ahead and take a look at Cloud Spanner. All right there. And it basically says it's a fully managed, mission-critical relational database service. And again, the goal of Cloud Spanner is to provide your organization with a geographically dispersed SQL service. Now, SQL traditionally, relational databases traditionally don't scale well. With Cloud Spanner, this is a proprietary application that they created to address scaling SQL. And you can create an instance. And basically, you have two choices. You could do a regional or a multi-regional config for an instance. You could add nodes, and you could also basically adjust the costs that you're wanting to scale with. So again, I could call this whatever I want, and I'm just putting in a name. Hopefully, that won't be taken. And then, let's say US East 1. And you can see that it tells me the config details, number of nodes, again. Now, node guidance, read this. This is actually pretty good that they do this. Basically, each of the nodes can go to 10,000 IOPS. Basically reads 2,000 QPS of writes, tells you the number of rows and the amount of storage that it can scale. Minimum of 3 nodes is recommended for production environments, right? So again, this is just playing around. I could put in 2 or 3 or, whatever I want. And, again, remember that you're paying for this, so you don't want to scale more than what you really need. Cost, it tells you the cost per hour, so you could go ahead and, just play around with this. Like with 2 nodes, you could see it goes down. And if I just do it with 1 node, you could see that it drops about half. So again, it really depends on what you need. But for the exam, there is one thing I wanted to just refresh your memory on with Cloud Spanner. And the first thing is to be aware that Cloud Spanner is a proprietary managed service. It's not SQL per se in the sense that it's an open source. This is a proprietary app. Now, once you create the service, what you have to do is then create a database. And you go ahead and call this, whatever you want. Actually, I want to do something better like mytestdb GCP course. Probably that should be okay. Okay. And now I could go ahead and define a schema. Now, remember, a schema is going to define how the database is structured. So I could go ahead and add a table. I could edit it as text. So I could put in basically DDL statements. I could add a table this way as well, right? And again, just, for short demo purposes, that's what you want to know. I'm not going to start an instance just because my bill's already fairly high, and you want to, $102 just for doing this one course. So just be aware that you want to, spin up services that you need, and if you don't need them, spin them down. Because one of the challenges with services is very easy to spin them up. Sometimes you're going to forget about them. So what I encourage you to do, especially in your production environments and your dev environments for your companies, proactively every week look at what's running. Look at the billing reports. Set up alerts. Because if you don't, you're going to have bills that'll run you through the roof. Now, as far as APIs, I want to take 1 minute to talk about APIs a little bit more in detail. You can see that there's different APIs. Over here it tells you traffic, latency that's being experienced. This is 1 hour. Let's go to, let's say, 1 day. So again, you can see that the traffic hasn't been too much going on. Again, this is just more of a test account I set up for building the course. You can see that there's different services. Remember too that, again, these APIs have to be enabled in the project, right? And if I want to use Cloud SQL, right, what do I have to do? I got to enable that, right? And I could disable it, right? And it tells you, again, if you're going to disable the service, you got to make sure that you pay attention, right? And then cloud service, cloud storage, right? It says code that uses these project keys, blah, blah, blah. Do you want to disable this? Cancel? No. But again, look at the different services like monitoring. Again, that's disabled, right? So again, these are all enabled, but again, you don't want to disable something if you need it. But let's say I'm not using Kubernetes. I could go ahead and disable that, right? It says, okay, but it's saying, wait a minute, you're using a service and it's probably using Kubernetes. So you got to pay attention to what you can and can't enable. Library, this is where you go to find APIs. And this is the API library. Now, to get to the library, you go to API services and library. That's if you're in the console. And again, there's also, you go directly to the API library. It's essentially a marketplace. And you can see that they've got, all kinds of APIs for different services. Anything that you could think of, like if you want to go over to, let's say something fun like security. There's only one there, key management. But if I go over here to CRM, Google Sheets. So you can see that there still isn't a large library of APIs available. But again, you could check out to see what is available and what isn't. And again, you go over here. Let's say you did want to use one of these APIs. Let's say I want to do map for SDK for Android. I go to enable that. And you can see it's going to bring me over to the cloud platform, to the API section, and it'll go ahead and enable that API. So for this exam, to enable APIs, what you need to do is go to Security IAM and then go over to APIs and then the library. All right. And actually, I need to go back to, see here, API library. Okay, API and services, and then select library. That's really the workflow I want you to be aware of. And to enable APIs, you select what? That brings you to the library as well. Now, credentials. You could also create credentials a couple different ways. You can use a service key account, OAuth, and an API key as well. So you have a few choices there. All right, that's about all that I had. Let's continue on.